The UN thought it was prepared for Trump's return. It wasn't. This article by Richard Gowan was published at worldpoliticsreview.com on March 19, 2025. It is now almost exactly 2 months since U.S. President Donald Trump returned to the White House and set about weakening the United Nations. On his first day in office, Trump announced that the U.S. would quit the Paris Agreement on climate change as well as the World Health Organization. At the time, I argued that these were predictable maneuvers, as he had taken similar steps in his first term. Diplomats and international officials in New York were resigned to Trump taking early potshots at the UN, but hoped that he would move on to other targets. 2 months later, UN insiders admit that the new administration has done far more harm to the institution than they had expected, and they worry that it will do even greater damage before long. While the administration's cuts to foreign aid have hit UN agencies hard, UN officials had expected to face financial strains. But Washington has also blocked information sharing by U.S. government entities with their UN counterparts on issues ranging from epidemics to indicators of famine. That has stopped the flow of data that UN agencies often relied on more than they would care to admit. In parallel, U.S. diplomats in New York and Geneva have instructions to purge multilateral documents of references to words the Trump administration dislikes, like gender and diversity. These strictures have upset routine UN committee processes on issues ranging from children's well-being to peacekeeping, as U.S. negotiators have focused on these semantic points to the exclusion of all other topics. Their foreign counterparts quip that U.S. diplomats simply use the Ctrl+F keyboard shortcut to search draft texts for offending nouns and verbs to cut, in order to win credit with Washington. Foreign officials in New York had always expected the Trump administration to be transactional rather than principled in its multilateral diplomacy. But its obsession with rooting out supposedly leftist notions has convinced many that it is ultimately following a right-wing ideological template, making it significantly harder to bargain with. The U.S. has reinforced this view by circulating a questionnaire to UN agencies asking if they have had any association with communists or other anti-American forces. While senior figures in New York have tracked the White House's attacks, they have had few real openings to understand U.S. thinking. The Senate confirmation of Trump's nominee as ambassador to the UN, Representative Elise Stefanik, has been put on hold to allow Stefanik to remain in Congress, as the slim and unruly Republican majority makes her vote indispensable for upcoming budgetary negotiations. Beleaguered diplomats at the U.S. mission to the UN have tended to postpone big decisions until her eventual arrival, which is now expected in early April but could slip further into the future. Some major U.S. initiatives, such as the decision to side with Moscow rather than Kyiv in a series of General Assembly and Security Council votes in February marking the anniversary of Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, have seemed quite haphazardly put together. The bleakest observers suspect that the Trump administration not only does not care about the UN but actively wants to subvert it. Worried UN member states have been urging the organization's leaders to try to get ahead of this burgeoning crisis. In February and early March, major financial donors to the UN fretted that Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who handled Trump quite successfully in his first term, was not taking the scale of the current U.S. threat seriously. Last week, Guterres announced a review of the UN's mandates and structures to identify savings and efficiencies. He has, rather unconvincingly, tried to present this as an independent initiative rather than a stopgap response to Trump. Looking ahead, denizens of the UN bubble broadly fall into 3 categories. Optimists believe that, for all its ideological baggage, the administration will eventually return to a more pragmatic approach to multilateral affairs. They point out that there are multiple issues on which the UN could be quite helpful to Washington, from stemming lawlessness in Haiti to monitoring a potential ceasefire in Ukraine. There is also a certain grim calculus that once the global impact of aid cuts become clear to U.S. voters, with images of hunger and disease flooding the media, the administration will need to quietly re-engage with humanitarian agencies. Nobody thinks that Trump will rethink his views on climate or gender, but he could still return to the UN as a useful foreign policy tool when it serves his interests. More pessimistic observers worry that the administration is immune to such concerns and will continue to pursue culture wars at the UN rather than revert to cooperation. They also see further political breaking points in U.S. UN relations looming. This week's renewed violence in Gaza could lead to angry debates in the Security Council and General Assembly, just as the Israel-Hamas war did during the administration of former President Joe Biden. Economically developing countries are also increasingly likely to call out U.S. aid cuts, as well as cuts by other affluent countries, against the backdrop of a very troubled global economy. The bleakest observers suspect that the Trump administration not only does not care about the UN but actively wants to subvert it. They note that some of Trump's apparent obsessions, such as his interest in annexing Greenland, run directly counter to the principles of the UN Charter. They also suspect that U.S. kibitzing about words such as gender is not just cheap point scoring, but rather part of a broader campaign to undo many of the values the UN embodies. In their darker moments, UN insiders speculate that the U.S. could quit the organization altogether. This is not new. There were similar rumors buzzing around New York in 2020, during the final year of Trump's first term. But the new administration has launched a review of all U.S. treaty obligations, which could in theory be an opening to renounce the UN Charter. It probably won't go that far. The U.S. is very unlikely to completely sacrifice its position of power in the UN, especially its ability to use its veto in the Security Council to protect its friends. But it may be of small comfort if the U.S. stays inside the UN, as it has the financial and political clout to cause a great deal more pain from within. Richard Gowan is the UN director of the International Crisis Group. From 2013 to 2019, he wrote a weekly column for WPR. Follow him on Twitter at RichardGowan1.